In 2021, the commander of Israeli intelligence published a book on designing a special machine that would resolve what he described as a human bottleneck for locating and approving targets in war. A recent investigation by Plus 972 magazine and Local Call reveals that the Israeli army has developed an artificial intelligence-based program known as Lavender, which does exactly that. According to 6 Israeli intelligence officers with first-hand experience, the Lavender AI machine determined who to kill and was obeyed with military discipline. During the first weeks of the war, the Lavender system designated about 37,000 Palestinians as targets and directed airstrikes on their homes. Despite knowing that the system makes errors about 10% of the time, there was no requirement to check the machine's data. The Israeli army systematically attacked the targeted individuals at night, in their homes, while their whole family was present. An automated system known as Where's Daddy was used to track the targeted individuals and carry out when they entered their families' residences. The obvious result was that thousands of women and children were wiped out by Israeli airstrikes. According to these Israeli intelligence officers, the IDF them in homes as a first option, and on several occasions, entire families were murdered when the actual target was not inside. In one instance, 4 buildings were destroyed along with everyone inside because a single target was in one of them. When it came to targets marked as low level by the AI Lavender system, cheaper bombs were used, which destroyed entire buildings, mostly civilians and entire families. This was done because the IDF did not want to waste expensive bombs on who they deemed as unimportant people. It was decided that for every low-level Hamas operative that Lavender marked, it was permissible to kill up to 15 or 20 civilians. And if the target was a senior Hamas official, more than 100 civilians was acceptable. Most of these AI targets were never tracked before the war. The Lavender software analyzed information collected on the 2.3 million residents of the Gaza Strip through a system of mass surveillance, assessed the likelihood of each person being a militant, and gave a rating from 1 to 100. If the rating was high enough, then they were killed along with their entire family. Lavender flagged individuals who had patterns similar to Hamas, including police, civil defense, relatives, and residents who had similar names and nicknames. This sort of tracking system has existed in the US for years.
What I will be providing you and the fine gentleman of the Secret Service is a list of every threat made about the president since February 3rd, and a profile of every threat maker.
And these are, like, existing targets?
Oakland resident Justin Pinsky posted on a message board, and take out Bush.
How is this all possible?
Keyword selectors. Attack, take out, Bush. So think of it as a Google search, except instead of searching only what people make public, we're also looking at everything they don't. So emails, chats, SMS, whatever.
Yeah, but which people?
The whole kingdom, Snow White.
And while many people claim that Israel controls the US, Joe Biden said that Israel serves US interests.
There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
We're learning new details today about the 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen who were killed by Israel's military in Gaza. All 7 victims have now been identified, including an American. The airstrikes destroyed the victims' cars on Monday in what Israel claims was a case of mistaken identity.
This is a direct provocation designed to precipitate a major response from Iran. If Iran cannot be dragged into this war, then it is very unlikely that Mr. Netanyahu will be able to drag us into his war on his side. So, simply put, why would you attack the sovereign territory, which is what a consulate or embassy is, as you know, of Iran? You want Iran to attack you so that you can precipitate a war that will involve the United States against Iran on your side.
If the mullahs do nothing, if they exercise Putin-like restraint, what do you expect Netanyahu to do? Ratchet up the attacks on Iran to do everything he can to goad them?
Yes, I would think so. I mean, there's no alternative for him. He knows that he's got to attack Hezbollah, and that's a foregone conclusion. It's just a question of when. So he's got to drag in Iran into this mess as he sees it. Now, what he's not paying attention to is the coalescing of the rest of the region against him. He's not paying much attention to what's going on up in Turkey, for instance. The Turkish population is enraged at Israel, and the Turkish population just rejected Erdogan at the polls. Now, there were several reasons for that, but one of them was Erdogan's continuous provision of oil and food and other things to the Israelis, despite all of his tough talk. And the Turks really want to go after the Israelis. They want action against them. And the Arabs are looking at the Turks as their leaders because they are the one Sunni Muslim power with real military capability that could defeat Israel, because they know that the neighbors cannot.
If Iran attacks Israel, if Iran engages in a war for Israel, that's not a pinprick tit for tat, but a serious war, wouldn't you expect Russia to come to Iran's side? And wouldn't this effectively, thank you, Prime Minister Netanyahu, commence a regional war, almost World War III?
Well, I think that's true, and I've been saying that for a long time, and people don't seem to understand or grasp it. You have the failed war that Washington's been waging in Ukraine. Ukraine is destroyed, and we continue to provoke Russia at every opportunity. I think they're talking about stealing $300 billion Russian funds and turning this over to the Ukrainians. The fools on the Hill want to do this. This kind of behavior makes it inevitable that if we become involved in a conflict with Iran, that the Russians will come to the aid of Iran. There's no question about it. They've deployed forces down into the Red Sea. Their submarines are already in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and they have forces in the Mediterranean. So it's a foregone conclusion that if Mr. Netanyahu is successful and we are dragged into this, we will end up fighting with the Russians directly.
Talk to me about the rage that you mentioned a few minutes ago, Colonel. Is it of such a magnitude that leaders in the area, Turkey, Iran, Jordan, may feel pressured into doing something lest something happen against their will?
Oh, absolutely. This is already true in Egypt and Jordan. And I would argue Saudi Arabia, the Emirates are all under pressure. The elites in the region are under tremendous pressure. And if they don't act, they all stand an excellent chance of going away. General Sisi has tried, as many others, to be on both sides of the fence. On the one hand, he's tried to speak out against what the Israelis are doing, but he's had to renegotiate his enormous national sovereign debt. He's needed our support for that. He wants to keep the United States on side. How much longer that goes on is hard to tell, because the Russians and the Chinese may well step in and offer to help him, which would then grant him some freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis Israel. Then you have the Jordanians, and the Jordanian king is hanging on, I think, by his fingernails. He's a very competent man. He's a brilliant leader. He has negotiated the troubled waters of the region with great alacrity. I don't think he wants in any way, shape, or form to be at war with Israel, but he has over 1 million enraged Palestinians who want to attack Israel. And I don't think he's going to have much longer to stave it off. I think he's in a very, very sensitive position.
Everybody comments about how lawless, but also how smart Benjamin Netanyahu is. He's a survivor. How dumb was it for the Israelis to follow for an hour and a half a truck with food workers, and then to use 3 missiles to kill 7 people, including an American in that truck? Talk about enraging the public. That's resonating even over here, Colonel.
Well, this is one of the things that reached the American people, and the American people were disturbed by it. But this is not new. These instances of operators of unmanned aerial systems tracking and then killing people who, frankly, were simply in the open, had nothing to do with the enemy per se, Hamas or anything else, are frequent. These things have happened very frequently, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this is an exercise in casual murder at the whim of the Israelis. And the Israeli leadership, remember, they made it very clear from the beginning that Gaza is full of enemies. If you're in Gaza, you're probably an enemy. They're not going to stop their soldiers from killing anyone, and they're certainly not going to stop the Air Force or the operators of these unmanned systems from killing anyone.
No way this was a mistake, Colonel, no matter what Netanyahu says. Nobody believes him anyway. Nobody in the West. Well, I shouldn't say nobody in the West. Biden and that crowd believe him. Admiral Kirby believes him. They continue to justify what he does. Who challenges Netanyahu in the West besides people like Dennis Kucinich and you and Scott Ritter and me?
Well, there's nothing more reliable than a man that can be bought with cold, hard cash, right? And people need to understand that that's the case in Washington. Most of your political class is bought and paid for by the Israeli lobby. They're not going to jeopardize their positions, their income, their access under any circumstances. The other point I would make here, though, that Americans don't seem to understand, I don't think a lot of people do, he called it a war zone. Well, it is, but it isn't. It is and it isn't. First of all, Hamas does not have an integrated air defense system. Hamas is organized, and they're obviously tenacious fighters, but they're not an army. They have rockets, and they use them, and they fire them when they can, but it's a minimum of fire support. And finally, they don't have any naval forces. So you're dealing with essentially guerrillas that, yes, they do swim inside the population, but normally we don't annihilate the entire population on the grounds that it contains a few guerrillas. That's collective punishment. We don't engage in that kind of thing. The bottom line is that this fog of war argument, it wasn't clear. We didn't know. I don't think that's legitimate in this sense at all. Certainly not in this case. Remember, the Israeli troops opened fire on some of their own people who had actually escaped custody and were trying to reach them. This was very early in this entire war, and they were very trigger happy, and they killed their own people. It was only when they finally got close enough to see who they were, they realized they'd killed Israelis. So this is a sort of a free fire zone in the worst sense of the word. It reminds me a lot of Vietnam and some of the things that we did there.
Colonel, when Netanyahu says, and he says it repeatedly, that he wants to eliminate Hamas, he said recently he thinks it can be done in a couple of weeks. Isn't Hamas an idea? Isn't it impossible for him to eliminate Hamas?
Well, I made that comment early on that killing an idea is much more difficult than killing people. But what this campaign has done is elevated Hamas to a level of notoriety and celebrity that it would never have otherwise had. And that's one of the reasons that I think Netanyahu, in his anger, along with the Israeli public, has said, well, then they all must pay for this. The only solution is the final solution. Eradicate this population once and for all. Hatred has taken over. Emotion has taken over. There is no rational calculus unless you want to judge plans for the annihilation of Arabs in Gaza, in the West Bank, and potentially southern Lebanon as a rational calculus. I think that's simply where we are. By the way, to get back briefly to the Iranians, I think it's important to understand that over the last 5 or 6 weeks, we've heard nothing out of these so-called Iraqi and Syrian Shiite militias. They've gone quiet. They had been attacking us. I think now, after this strike on the consulate, we're likely to see them stir once again and begin attacking us, as well as the Israelis, if they can do it.
Do you think the Iranian government has restrained them?
Yes, I think the Iranian government pleaded with them to back off. And unlike the Houthis, who are far more independent and autonomous, the Iraqi Shiite militias heeded the call for restraint. I think that restraint will now end, and they'll probably work very, very hard to attack us, and as I said, the Israelis in whatever way they can. I don't think you're going to see a deliberate counterstrike from Iranian soil, because again, the Iranians don't want a war. This is a thing that has to be understood. Nobody in the region except the Israelis and the United States are enthusiastic about the war.
If the Iranians give Netanyahu his war, how powerful is the Iranian military, and how modern is its arsenal of offensive weaponry?
Well, remember, the Iranian army, the ground force, is very small. And the Republican or Revolutionary Guard Corps is really a special operations and special forces element. They go out and work with the various Shiite groups and organizations. They've helped to train and equip these Shiite militias. But they're not really capable of taking the field against the Israeli Defense Force. And frankly, it's too far away. They don't have the logistical infrastructure to sustain anything. Iran's trump card is this arsenal of rockets and missiles, primarily theater and tactical ballistic missiles, but also cruise missiles. And they can reach virtually any target inside Israel. And if they were to attack, I think they would unleash everything. Because once you begin trading missile strikes, restraint doesn't make any sense. You end up in a position where you either use it or you lose it. And why would the Iranians wait around for the United States Air Force and the U.S. Naval Air to attack them and essentially put their arsenal at risk? If they're compelled to fight, I think they would probably launch massive strikes. Now, the other thing is that they're well prepared. They have dispersed a lot of their capabilities. They have dispersed command and control. Even if we destroy much of the command and control, it will still persist. It's very redundant. And so I think it could turn into a long war. The people, of course, who will suffer most are the Israelis at home and the Iranians inside Iran, because Iran's a desert country. I'm sure they will attack water supplies, water purification plants, water distribution points, energy distribution, this sort of thing. And that will have a catastrophic effect on the Iranian populace. That's something the Iranian leadership doesn't want. And as a result, they've been very careful at this point to restrain their own forces from attacking. But, that could end quickly, depending upon next moves by Israel.